Is this on? It is on. Good morning, Your Holiness. It's wonderful to have you here. And to you and to the esteemed director of this institute, to the faculty and staff, to all of the visitors and students and friends, I wish you all a welcome to the second day of this really extraordinary dialogue. And I wish to use just a very few minutes at the beginning to extend my personal congratulations and thanks once again to the Central Institute of the Higher Tibetan Studies on the occasion of this 50th anniversary. Jose Cabazon yesterday talked about some of the things that the Institute does, of which people may not be aware, and I want to extend that a little bit, because this Institute has also been a leader in international exchange. And Your Holiness, this is, as you know, largely due to your efforts when 27 years ago you instructed me and Samdong Rinpoche to establish this exchange program, which has now been going for 26 years between the 5 colleges and now Australia and this institution. Academic exchange is such an important thing for universities, and especially for a community like the Tibetan community that is really entering and integrating with the rest of the world. And this university has been a real leader in that field under the leadership of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, the Most Venerable Professor Samdong Rinpoche, and Geshe Ngawang Samten. But many people don't understand the full scope of the exchange, so I want to spend a few minutes explaining that. It's not just that we bring students here and that students from this institute and from Tseni Lobta go to study in the West. We also exchange faculty members with teachers from the West coming here and to other Tibetan institutions, and Tibetan teachers coming to the West to teach. We engage in joint research, Tibetan linguistics, cognitive science, medicine, Buddhist philosophy, comparative philosophy, major research programs that have been involved. The exchange model has spread from here to the Institute of Buddhist Dialectics and the library under the leadership of Geshe Lakdor, and with the work so many years ago of Genlop Sangyatso. It's been an extraordinary effort, but the leadership has always been here, and this is something to congratulate the Institute on. But I also want to make sure that when we think about this program, we recognize not only the leaders who you see up here on the stage, but also all of the teachers and students who have been involved in this, all of the staff members. It's one of those occasions when we congratulate the institution on its success, then when we can remind ourselves of the importance of dependent origination and of how much anything that any institution or any individual achieves depends upon the kindness and the contribution and the leadership of so many others. And to use this occasion not only to celebrate the Institute, but to rededicate ourselves to repaying that kindness. So thank you very much, Your Holiness, for your leadership in this venture, and Geshe Ngawang Samten for your leadership in this exchange work. And now I introduce our first speaker to the day, Professor Asanga Tilakaratne, one of the great experts on Theravada Buddhist philosophy.
Well, I'm not using it, so I don't need it actually. Yeah, that's right. So, very good morning to everybody, Your Holiness, distinguished guests, scholars gathered here. Let me first express my gratitude to Venerable Geshe Samten, the Vice Chancellor of this university, for inviting me for this occasion to speak on Theravada concept of mind. And also I am given this opportunity for me to be fortunate enough to express my ideas in the presence of His Holiness and this distinguished gathering. So without much further ado, let me get into the subject matter which I would like to discuss for this morning. Basically, what I'm going to do is to discuss the concept of mind in Theravada Buddhism. When I say Theravada Buddhism, what I mean by that is basically the Buddhist Pali Tripitaka, three canonical literature, and also the subsequent tradition that was developed in Theravada, such Theravada countries as Myanmar, Sri Lanka, and the places. So when we discuss the problem of mind in Indian philosophy, basically general Indian philosophy, and today we are coming to the idea of mind in Theravada Buddhism. So first, let me articulate the idea as it found in the basic discourses of the Buddha, and subsequently for me to go to some of the later developments in order to understand what do we mean by mind. So when I followed the discussions whole yesterday, I can see that still we are struggling with the concept of the basic, very basic idea that what is the mind we are talking about. I think this very understanding, the effort to understand this concept is very important in clarifying what we mean by this concept. Now, when I look at the Theravada tradition, we know that in this tradition, the Atma has been replaced by mind. Now, one of the unique and key features of the Buddha's teaching was to get rid of this agent in the substantial sense. Having removed the agent or Atman from the scene, Buddhism attributes the function that was generally attributed to Atman to the concept of mind. Now, this innovative teaching has not been very easy to grasp, even for the Buddhist, the followers of the Buddha themselves. Now, in the canon, we have this, there are many instances. One very well-known instance is a bhikkhu named Sati, who believed that it is the Vijnana. Of course, he accepted that there is no Atma, but in that place, he believed that it is the Vijnana that goes through from birth to birth without any change. And then Buddha said that this idea is wrong, and he said Vijnana is dependently arisen. So in other words, whether you accept Vijnana or anything, if it doesn't change, then of course it is tantamount to Atman. So Buddha said that Vijnana is dependently arisen. In the same manner, there are many instances. In another instance, a monastic disciple called, one monastic disciple, actually he thought that, Moliya Phaguna, he thought that there is someone who is partaking the nutrition of consciousness, Vijnana Ahara. Then Buddha said that question is wrong. And then he rephrased the question, for what is the nutriment consciousness a condition? So in other words, you can see that getting rid of the agent from the scene and attributing causality or understanding the whole process as a dependently arisen phenomenon. So interestingly, we can see that in the Buddhist analysis, mind has been assigned, mind has been put into the place of Atman. Now, what is this concept of mind in the Buddhist literature? When we think about this, we come across three key concepts found in the discourses, basically Chitta, Mano, and Vijnana. I'm not going to do in great detail study of these three concepts in the morning, But just to understand what these three concepts basically signify is an important thing. There are instances where Buddha uses these three concepts synonymously. So in that sense, you can see that these three concepts are interchangeable. However, when you look at the literature, you can clearly see that three concepts are being used in three very clearly definable contexts. For example, when we talk about chitta, chitta is basically spoken of as chitta is that which can be polluted, chitta is that which can be developed, chitta is which is responsible for your whether good or bad birth, and so on. So when you look at the term chitta, you can see that chitta is basically the, we can say, emotional aspect of our mind. So chitta is spoken as that which is liberated finally. In the Buddhist literature, ultimately we see this term very often when the Arahants describe their own status of mind, chittang asavehi vimucci. The mind was liberated from the defilements. So the chitta is basically that. And when we come to mano or manas, again we can see that manas is basically used as an indriya or faculty. So with eye, ear, tongue, nose and all these things, the sixth indriya is manas, which has its own domain, own subject matter, namely the phenomena or dharmas. In addition to that, manas plays a very important role as the coordinator of all the other senses. Now this is very interesting because according to Buddhist analysis, eye has to be combined with mano in order to see. So it's called mind consciousness, and the eye consciousness arises in connection, in association with mind. So in that sense, mano has its own domain of phenomena. At the same time, it goes through, it coordinates the domains of all the other senses. Now that is basically mano. And when we come to the idea of vijnana, vijnana is very interesting. Vijnana, or what we call consciousness, is basically the consciousness of associated with sensory faculties. Ear consciousness, eye consciousness, and so on. Chakshu indriya, and so on. So this is basically the idea of consciousness. In addition to that, consciousness also has, in the dependent origination formula, you have consciousness as a part of human experience and human entity. So in addition to being indriya, it has this aspect of 5 skandhas. So when we speak about the human being is understood as having rupa, vedana, sanya, sankhara, and vijnana. All these 5 aggregates. So in the 5 aggregates, vijnana is one of the key important things. So this is another aspect of vijnana. In addition to these 2 things, vijnana is also spoken of as that which connects this present birth to the next birth. So that part is also played by the vijnana, according to early discourses. And in addition to all these 3, there is a 4th aspect which is described in a Pali term called Sangvattanika vijnana that continues through. So the continuation of the psychological mental process throughout one's birth is also described in vijnana. Now, this is, as you can see, very, very brief, the exposition of Chitta Mano Vijnana. Of course, this has been extensively dealt with by scholars, but I don't want to go into this. Now, basically, you can see that although Chitta Mano and Vijnana are spoken of as synonymous, but still you can see that they capture a vast area of psychological import in the Buddhist literature. So ultimately this is very important, how to define this phenomenon called consciousness or mind. So according to Buddhism, you can see that it's very difficult to define it with one definitive term. It has to cover a large area. Now, when we look at the early Buddhist Theravada analysis of mind, one very important thing we can see is the fact that it is something dependently arisen. Now, of course, it contrasts with the Atma, which is independently existing, but the important thing is Vijnana or mind is dependently arisen. As the Buddha said to his disciple Sati, Vijnana is always dependently arisen. Now, what it means is ultimately, when you talk about eye consciousness or ear consciousness, for example, it is not something that exists all the time. Based on eye, based on ear, based on any other faculty, this consciousness arises. So that is what it means to be dependently arisen. In other words, we cannot talk about Vijnana or mind per se. A Vijnana is always a specific Vijnana. Mind is always a specific mind. When we see something, we have eye consciousness and so on. Now, you might think, how can this consciousness is always dependently arisen? What about when you don't have anything coming from your senses? Of course, there is an answer for that. Subsequent Buddhist tradition came up with the idea called bhavanga. Bhavanga means life continuum, which according to the subsequent Abhidharma tradition is mind continues through your life. So you have what is called the pratisandhi chitta, or the with which you are born. And finally, at the end of the life, you have what is called chuti chitta, with which your life is concluded. In between, you have the bhavanga process goes on unbroken. But bhavanga process is conditioned or dependently arisen on karma. So therefore, you can see that the basic idea of dependently arisen nature is retained, but the bhavanga process is there. Now, the philosophical significance of this is, when we are talking about the consciousness or mind, we are always talking about not only one single thing, but the whole network of things. Now, important philosophical implications of this is, very often we talk about this mind-body problem as if mind and body are existing independently. However, in the Buddhist tradition, this problem does not arise, mainly because you don't talk about the mind as independently existing. If it is Chakku Vijnana, Sota Vijnana, or the consciousness of eye or ear or whatever, it depends on various other factors. So in other words, there is no, in the Buddhist tradition, this mind-body problem, because you are not talking about mind or you are not talking about body, of course, as if they exist separately. But in the Buddhist tradition, you always come across references to mind, references to mano, references to vijnana. It is basically the way to talk about it. But we have to understand that every time we are talking about vijnana, we are talking about a particular vijnana. Every time we are talking about mano, we are talking about the particular mano. Every time we are talking about the chitta, we are talking about the particular chitta. Not really chitta existing per se, or vijnana existing per se, or mind or mano existing per se. Now, in that sense, when Buddhism is talking about this whole phenomena, you can see that it's talking about the whole network of things. Now, this is something very important implications of this. And the next important implication is, when Buddhism talks about mind or chitta, mano, it makes it very clear that this particular phenomenon is very fast moving. In one place, the Buddha says that even you cannot talk about, you can't give a simile how fast it moves. It is so fast. Now, this fastness has been, again, subsequent in the tradition, has been captured in what is called the kshana, or the moment. So the mind has been analyzed to have three moments: nascent moment, existing moment, and also the perishing moment. But within that three moments, we might think that when we talk about three, it is a long duration. Of course, it is not long duration. Within that process has been also analyzed into 17. I don't have time to go into those things, but I'm just giving you some basic idea. Now, summarizing what I have been trying to say during these few minutes is basically the concept of mind in Buddhism is a very complex phenomenon. And also it is a dependently arisen phenomenon. Although we talk about mind or consciousness or anything, we have to understand that we are talking about a complex phenomenon. Now, soteriologically, the significance of this is when we really realize this, we know that the mind arises without an agent, so the whole process arises without an agent. So in that sense, there is no agent, there is no Atman, but when the conditions are ripe, Buddha uses the simile of an egg being hatched. When the hen protects the eggs and ultimately it gets hatched without any extra effort. So that's one important significance. The second important significance I would like to underscore here is when we try to understand the cognitive science, the mind in this process or the consciousness in the process, I think we need to look at all the aspects together and try to come up with some very important key features of what we talked about in the Buddhist context as mind in order to further our research on neuroconsciousness. So with these few remarks, let me wind up and thank you very much for listening to me.
Your Holiness, may I invite you to reflect on this talk?
I was in time. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Again, you the Theravadas law, you know.
Theravadas the constitution is the beginning of the Kurkirwabine. Yeah. The came to sure. Tanda to the molecule and great. Continue to do it.
When we talk about Theravada and Theravada and Mula Sarvastivada tradition and so forth are actually defined on the basis of monastic Vinaya code lineage, and maybe there are few differences amongst them, but I usually prefer to use the Pali tradition and Sanskrit tradition. So because Theravada is one sect within the
So this is a sort of a general observation on how the Theravada tradition is understood from the Indo-Tibetan perspective. And generally in the Tibetan tradition, which is inherited from the Indian tradition, we tend to reserve the term Theravada for a particular lineage of Vinaya.
Okay.
That goes all the way back to the earliest, kind of division into the four main schools, lineages, and Theravada is one of those very, very early lineages.
Right.
Mula Sarvastivada tradition and the Theravada lineage, and then Mahasamgika, and so we don't remember. None of us can remember. La. What's it? Putraya is one of them. Yes. So the point His Holiness is making is that he finds it more helpful to distinguish historically between Pali tradition versus Sanskrit.
Okay.
So Pali tradition versus Sanskrit tradition. And so a large part of the Indian and Indo-Tibetan tradition are inheritors of the Sanskrit tradition. And in the Theravada world, what we see is the Pali tradition. Because otherwise, Theravada is generally understood to be a term that is confined more to a lineage coming from the Vinaya.
Right. Yeah.
As far as so Vinaya is concerned, Tibetan sort of Buddhist tradition, I think there are two, but major is Mula Sarvastivada.
Mula Sarvastivada tradition.
And the Pali tradition, Theravada tradition. These are lineage of
Correct.
Bhikshu Bhava,
Yes.
not a different school of thought. There are little differences, but these are not Kasota.
Significant, yeah.
Oh.
Significant.
Ah.
Not significant.
Oh.
Yeah.
And then some people used to use the word Mahayana and Hinayana. I totally sort of disfavor.
Yeah, I'm not in favor of using those terms.
Oh, you see, that creates impression. Or sometimes, you see, I'm telling people, the people who suppose follow Mahayana and look down Hinayana. Then Hinayana people say, oh, Mahayana, whether authentic Buddhist teaching or not. No use.
That's right. Yeah.
The Dharma, Buddha, the Kazata, Dodu Gongzene, Kolo Rinpo Sum Sun, Kolo Tangpo Di Pechi Bali Risha.
Okay. So in the Sanskrit tradition, one speaks of the three turnings of the wheel of Dharma. The first one is the basis of the Pali tradition.
Well, the second and third, mainly Sanskrit. Some of my friends, even if you question, Buddha knows Sanskrit or not. So in any way, Pali tradition is the foundation of Buddha Dharma.
That's right.
Oh.
Yes. I see.
And then about Vinaya practice, Shamatha, Vipassana, all these common. And Four Noble Truth. And then 37 Kasa, Changcho Sudin.
37 factors of enlightenment.
Oh, same,
That's right.
same. And generally, in principle, Anatma theory also same.
Correct.
The Shivchagu Kana, Kasoti, Lekjag Chugi Nani, Tame said, Shivchagu Kana, the Madrasa Tango.
So when we go into detail, of course, then even within the Sanskrit tradition, there's a lot of differences among the Buddhist philosophical schools on the interpretation of what exactly is the meaning of Anatman. What is that no self?
Firstly, Chitta Mantra, different view, different understanding about Shunyata, and then Madhyamaka. And within these two, the subdivisions, there are a lot of differences like that. But all, I think about Shunyata, more Kasota, more explanation in Sanskrit tradition.
Sanskrit text, yeah.
Wonderful.
Thank you, Venerable. Thank you so much. Yeah, I should be thankful to.
I think before Tibetan Buddhist tradition, some Western scholar described Lamaism, whether it is authentic Buddhism or not. So Hindu Tantrayana and Buddhist, some kind of mixed. And Tibetan Lamas also, you see, they prefer different sort of, dance or different masks, right? And like puja or something.
Yes.
So I think the
So sometimes the Tibetans themselves are to blame because they overemphasize the ritual aspects.
That's right.
So there is some sort of basis to describe Lamaism. Now, many scholars begin to realize Tibetan Buddhist tradition is true Nalanda tradition.
Okay.
Like that.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you, thank you so much, Your Holiness, for those comments, very enlightening comments. Within the Theravada tradition itself, we make a distinction between the early discourses and the subsequent developments in the Abhidharma. In fact, in my paper, I have mentioned that these subsequent concepts like bhavanga, life continuum, in certain respects, of course, seem to be very faithful to the earlier tradition. But of course, there are certain innovations. But basic concept of anatma and the dependently arisen character of the mind has been retained throughout. Now, in that sense, of course, we can talk about the Buddhist concept of mind in that sense. Yes.
Thank you very much, Professor Chilarakane.
Okay, thank
It was a beautiful talk, but we now have to move on because it is time for Michel Bipol to take the stage. Thank you.
Works, yes. Yes. This one, yes. Thank you. Full yes. Full screen. Okay. Window. Something better. Okay, good. Thank you. So thank you, and it's really an honor and a joy to speak to you once more. And since I don't want you to be bored, I change my topic each time. And this time I will speak about Erwin Schrödinger, a physicist, a creator of quantum mechanics, who had also a theory of mind and of matter that was very much inspired from some Indian philosophies. It was a mixture of Indian philosophies, some Advaita Vedanta, some drops of Buddhism also. So, exactly. So Erwin Schrödinger was well known as a pioneer of quantum mechanics. You don't have it?
I think you are using the presenter's view.
Yes.
Can you just press one more?
Yes, sorry. That's a pity. That's a pity. You think it's good? Does it work?
Sorry, we're just having the normal tech problems involved in using PowerPoint. Just be patient.
Yes. It's the second time that it happens to me. Yes. Does it work? Work? Doesn't work. Okay, so without PowerPoint, but I will help myself. So, in fact, Schrödinger was well known as a creator of quantum mechanics, so he was the author of two things. The author of the Schrödinger equation, that is a pillar of quantum mechanics, and also he was the author of the famous cat paradox, that is well known as an important paradox of quantum mechanics. So, second slide. Schrödinger's life was very interesting. He was born in Austria and he died in Austria, but after a long trip in England and in Ireland because he was escaping Nazism. But the most important thing I want to say about his biography is that he was interested in Indian philosophy since his teenage. And he read a lot of Indian philosophy while he was at the university. Then, after the First World War, he started again to read Indian philosophy because he wanted to become a philosopher. He didn't want to be a physicist. And at the end of his life, he wrote a very beautiful book called Mind and Matter, in which he exposes his philosophy, which is very much inspired by Indian philosophy. He read a lot of philosophy from India, as I told you. In fact, he had all the literature that was translated in German and English at that time, namely at the beginning of the 20th century. He read especially Deusen's Outline of the Vedanta, and also a lot of books about Buddhism, especially the book of Lafcadio Hearn about Zen Buddhism. On his grave, you find a table just at the bottom of the grave, which is located in Alpbach in Austria, in the Alps. And you see already a mark of this wonderful Indian-like philosophy. A philosophy that was monistic, I think. He says, all being is a one and only being, and that it continues to be when someone dies tells you that this one did not cease to be. Schrödinger was very critical about metaphysical views, yet he held a metaphysical view of his own. So we have to explain that. First of all, he was keen on Kant's critique of metaphysics in his critique of pure reason. You know that in this book, Kant had dilemmas of reason. Namely, there are two theses, two views, that are just as plausible rationally one than another. And therefore, since they are both as plausible as one another, that means that in fact reason contradicts itself when it sees views. Even more powerfully, you find Nagarjuna's tetralemma, in which you are dissolved the views about the inherent nature of things. Yet, in spite of this critical attitude, Schrödinger had a metaphysics, as I told you. He insisted, first of all, that the critical attitude towards metaphysical speculation has nowhere found a more marked expression than in Buddhist wisdom. Here he was thinking of Nagarjuna's critique of views. Yet he used metaphysical views as a guidance, and also, as a way for one view to be an antidote against another less advanced view. So that's the reason why he held a view, a non-dualist view of mind and matter that was borrowed essentially from Advaita Vedanta. According to Schrödinger, there were three basic illusions. The illusion of the duality of mind and matter, the illusion of the multiplicity of minds and consciousnesses, and the illusion of material bodies. Just to say something about the multiplicity of mind and consciousness, according to Schrödinger, the idea of the multiplicity of minds and consciousness is a construct, is a concept. Our basic experience is that there is only one consciousness. We experience only one consciousness that we wrongly call my consciousness. But there is only one. Also, he was very averse about the idea that there are multiple minds, multiple bodies also. He said, myriads of suns surrounded by possibly inhabited planets, multiplicity of galaxies, each one of its myriads of suns. According to me, all this is Maya, even if a very lawful and interesting Maya. So you see, he was a physicist. He studied galaxies, planets, and laws of nature, but he found that all these things were essentially illusion, Maya. But, as he said, because he was a physicist, interesting Maya. The illusion of many minds, as I told you, he had a very special feeling about that and a very special experience. He said, think of this man, such as this one. You say, you see this man standing on the right of the picture. Think of this man who was standing here 1 century ago. Was he another person? Wasn't he identical to you? But after all, what is your I? So he was critical about personal identity, about the substantiality of the ego. It is by thinking, especially the individual ego, it is by thinking this way that one suddenly experiences the truth of Advaita Vedanta. The life that you are living presently is not only a fragment of existence, it is, in a certain sense, the whole. Yet, in spite of this Advaitin way of thinking, he had also a very strong criticism of the substantiality of the I, similar to David Hume, to Ernst Mach, and to Buddhism. According to him, individual ego is only a complex of thoughts and sensations temporarily associated. Schrödinger has also a Buddhist conception, or Buddhist-like conception of reincarnation. He says this: it is certain that the earth will give birth to you again and again for new struggles and new sufferings. And not only in the future, it resuscitates you now, today, every day. Not just once, but several thousand times, exactly as it buries you every day, several thousand times. So the idea is that our personal identity is not a substance. It is a process with causes and effects. Each state of mind causes a following state of mind. And therefore, you disappear and resuscitate at every moment. I think this is a very similar view with respect to Buddhism. And here we see a view that is expressed in King Milinda's dialogue. He who is reborn, Nagasena, is the same person or another. Neither the same nor another. That means that reincarnation doesn't mean, passing one soul from one body to another, but it's passing a process, a causal process. And therefore, the following state is neither the same nor another with respect to the previous state. But how does the illusion of many minds arise? First of all, Schrödinger gave a comparison. When a dreamer has dreams of several characters, the dreamer is one, and yet the characters are many. So in the same way, we have the illusion of many minds, but there is only one, according to Schrödinger. Now, the mechanism, how comes that we believe in the multiplicity of mind? The reason why we believe in the multiplicity of mind is that we project minds on objects. And in order to frame, to build our concept of objects, we need first to extract from our experience everything subjective and keep only structures, conceptual structures or mathematical structures that can be shared between all of us. In this way, we get an objective knowledge. But then, when we do that, we ascribe conscious experience to objectified bodies that we believe are out there. This very common view in science and in scientific materialism has very negative consequences for Western science and ethics. The first negative consequence is that we have what is called the heart problem. hard problem of the material origin of consciousness. Why is it so? Because we first extract ourselves from our experience in order to keep only the structures, then the scientific structures, then we try to recover consciousness, to deduce consciousness from these objectified structures. But it's absurd because objectified structures has precisely been elaborated by extracting our subjectivity from it. So recovering subjectivity from objectivity is a contradiction in terms. First problem. Second problem, it's ethics. You know, the materialist view of the world is inherently non-ethical. And Schrödinger has a wonderful way of putting things. Dear reader, recall the bright, joyful eyes with which your child beams upon you when you bring him a new toy. And then let the physicist tell you that in reality nothing emerges from these eyes. In reality, their only objectively detectable function is continually to be hit by and to receive light quanta. In reality, a strange reality, something seems to be missing in it. When you see a child objectively, you lose the flavor of the contact, of the love. So the materialist outlook is poor ethically. Then, illusion of many bodies. First of all, you know, what is a body? According to a philosopher of mind such as Schrödinger, a body is just that. It is, you know, the focus of many perceptions. One, your present perception, the perceptions that you believe others have of the same object, and the perceptions you will have in the future if you go around and see it from different sides. So, in fact, an object is a complex, is not an inherently existing thing. Now, this usually, in everyday life, these complexes are very stable, and therefore you believe that they are substantial. But do atoms and electrons, so the micro-object, do they really exist in the same sense as tables and chairs? And Schrödinger answers, no, they don't. They are not similar to chairs and table. Why? Because they are unstable. They cannot be followed dot after dot, point after point, continuously in space and time. And therefore, they have a different mode of existence. What is a particle which has no trajectory or no path, asked Schrödinger? The particles, in the naive sense of the old days, do not exist. And he could have said they do not exist inherently. Now, what is the relation between this philosophy of mind and matter, borrowed essentially from Advaita Vedanta, and Schrödinger's views of physics? Not so many, in fact, but there are two types of relations. First relation, it's complementarity. Second relation, it's inspiration. Yes, philosophy complements science because science is incomplete. As you have seen before, science misses the view of the subjective. Therefore, in philosophy, you can open up the attention towards subjectivity also. Second point, philosophy was an inspiration for Schrödinger's physics. For instance, in 1925, the very year he created quantum physics, he said particles are nothing but a kind of foam crest on a fundamental radiation wave. The idea that beings, you know, visible beings, are just foam on an ocean evokes a metaphor of the Upanishad. Secondly, Schrödinger had a non-dualist view of his own cat paradox. And now I will explain you the cat paradox. The cat paradox is illustrated in this picture. There is a complex device, and then the poor cat is doomed to die if there is a flask of poison that is broken in the box. But the paradox is that it is said that quantum mechanics describes the cat after the experiment in a supposed state both alive and dead. But the cat is found, when you open the door of the lab and you see in it, the cat is found to be either alive or dead. Therefore, there is a paradox. Now, what are the materialist answers? The materialist answers is that cats are inherently real. Therefore, their states are also inherently real. The question they raise is how can their states spontaneously collapse? And there are many attempts to find a mechanism for the collapse, because materialists want mechanisms. Now, there is also a possible dualist answer. The dualist answer is that there are material elements described by quantum mechanics, but there are also consciousnesses that are different, distinct from that. And in the dualist answer, collapse is imposed when consciousness perceives the cat. Suddenly, consciousness, in that view, consciousness collapses the state. Schrödinger was critical of both views, both materialist view and dualist view. According to him, when he first formulated the cat's paradox, the cat's experiment prevents us from naively accepting as valid a blurred model of representing reality. According to him, the fact that the cat was represented as blurred, as both alive and dead, was the proof that the state function could not be a description of reality. And therefore, he discarded the materialist picture of inherently existing cat and here inherently existing wave function or state vectors. Quantum states, in fact, are nothing of this kind. They are not inherent description of an inherent reality. They are just probabilistic anticipations of phenomena that are co-arising with the act of observation. In this way, you immediately dispel the cat paradox, because the so-called superposition is no longer an inherent superposition, it's a relative superposition, relative to a future act of observation. And here is this outlook of Schrödinger's philosophical views. Thank you very much.
Your Holiness, I invite you to comment.
From one point of view, I'm trying to find out the final answer, inference, based on the inferences, and the part. Buddhism explained part of the part of the objection. If you are not rectify, try to analyze and rectify, then you see it as a real. But once you investigate, analyze, then you find it.
간다다 가서 저기 런진 똑벌레 아니 제타데레 더 지든 여드면서 더 녀석이 덤으로다 뒤에 간다다 다든 제
Now, all the complexity of understanding the reality, it's it's surfaced only by engaging in analytical system of trying to find the reality of.
저장 quantum physics 탄에 즉 이시게 된 게 미치기 두 다시 제인도 전에 그게 상보다 담바 타직도 그게 담바직 요말이지. 자, 진짜 인도 전에 그 타직도 배
or from the point of view of quantum physics, he says there's no good and evil.
자, 진짜 인도 전에 간다 뒤에 셔야 그 점진디 아주 동해면도 버지 리세 접공도 따이네 그 뭐라는지 르 차단 데이터네 아니 지금 능주 점라 대체 데이터네 아니 뭐라는지 지금 초도 리스제네 다 된대게 터네 아니 차단 걸로 지를 해야지 다디 안다 고물루루기 다디 디송도가 레다 뇨모 세르 타르 레다 뇨모 남돌레 사디 뇨 레디 뇨모 왕중레스 뇨모디 취미식 남도 왕중레스 땡내한테 뭐시면 체리고도 볼라 되게 따라쓰기 셔단계베 그도리야 셔단계서 유디 자주 자도 메두고 통되게 그랬어 디 자주 고스타고 남도 쬐샤스 따다다야 쓰디 자 디레 인도산에 딱 간다 된대기다 그게 잡아 심유탄에 또 심주자디 간다 소수 셈기 모두의 차디디 당아주 머리고 하시네 산지 좀 된 대기 빨리기 중 나눠네 아니 단지나 중이 손네 아니 군주고원 조름기 자원선지선에 머리고 하셔야지 아니 루도기 야 아니 냥다 토야셔야지 머리고 도나 아니 두지 도그레신 두송다 머리고 써야지 자원송도 동행서 머리고 그랬어 또 머리고 써야지 미국 가는 메네 딘 진단 컨디지기 다 요래 다 디땅을 보여 된다라 잡아지들 내야지 느르샤.
So, listening to your presentation, what it brings to my mind is the paradox of this kind of critical inquiry, because a lot of this inquiry are driven by searching for a deeper understanding of the nature of reality. But at the end of the process, what you find seems to be at such odds with our naive perception of the world. So this is why in the Buddhist tradition, and also generally in Indian tradition, a distinction is drawn between the relative world as we perceive and experience, and the ultimate level of reality. Even in Sankhya tradition, we heard yesterday, there is a distinction between two levels of truth. So what this suggests is that, our inquiry, all of this philosophical inquiry, is really driven by a quest for understanding the nature of reality. And as you delve deeper and deeper, what is revealed really points in quite a different direction from the way in which we will perceive the world. So that's why in Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, after giving a whole list of various factors of existence as well as enlightenment, and then at the end, the statement concludes that all of these are mere words, all of these are mere concepts. None of them really exist. Yes. So there is that paradox thrown in. So then the question has to be asked: why are all of these great thinkers and teachers really asking us to get into such deep inquiry? And here, Shantideva, in his 8th chapter at the beginning, he says that all of the preceding explanations have been given for the sake of cultivating wisdom. Yes. And those who wish to overcome, in the 9th chapter. So he says all the preceding explanations has been presented for the sake of cultivating wisdom, and those who wish to seek the elevation of suffering needs to cultivate wisdom. So that really is the point, because the point is a lot of the suffering in our life and in the world are created because we are so fixated on the apparent world that we perceive of our naive view of the world. Yes. And based on that, we make categorical distinctions, we reify, we latch on, we get attached and fixated, which then give rise to a whole host of emotional reactions to our experience and to the world, which then leads to all sorts of behavior. So, and this is beautifully captured in Nagarjuna's Mula Madhyamaka Karika, fundamental stanzas on the middle way, where he says that karmic actions come from falsified forms of thinking, which all of them are rooted in afflictions, which are ultimately rooted in avidya, ignorance. And we know in the Pali tradition, for example, the teaching on the 12 limbs of dependent origination, which explains the process by which we take rebirth. The first member of the chain, in that chain, is avidya, ignorance. And ignorance gives rise to volition, which then imprints on the consciousness and so on. And to reverse that process, it is only by bringing an end to ignorance that we will be able to give rise to cessation. So all of this really underlines the point that the importance of engaging in such critical inquiry is really for the sake of overcoming suffering.
Yes.
And that, I think, is an important point that we need to bear in mind. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
So, since many years, I sort of also some kind of sort of also wondering, those quantum physicists who really believe things does not exist objectively. You see, not just intellectually sort of explaining and understanding, but truly believe that, then these people, I'm wondering whether their sort of contact with sort of our daily life, something good, attractive attachment, some negative anger, so might be less such real sort of full conviction, nothing exists objectively. So recently, I heard one article wrote by one Chinese quantum physicist. He mentioned those people, you see, who believe that, you see, their reaction when they contact with, you see, there's some negative or positive things happen, their also the emotional sort of reaction is much neutral.
Yes, that's right.
So that person, I think, do not know whether religious person or not. That's just scientist like that. So these are the related with the reduced ignorance. Now ignorance, there are many different levels. I think obviously 7 billion human beings, everyone want happy life, do not want suffering, do not want enemy. So the sources of enemy is your anger. So now, whether realize or not, the all sort of negative thing ultimately created from here. That also, you see, very much based on ignorance.
Yes.
So now, so all those, I think, especially Indian sort of tradition, investigate, now for example, where's Atma or this complicated thing, you see, try to reduce wrong view. I feel like that.
That's right. Yes.
So according to my own little experience, I have some sort of experience on these wisdom really impact my destructive emotion. Very clear.
Yes.
자상가?
Thank you.
안다 들이 안다. 자시로.
30 seconds.
안다 가서 주고디. 댄지대와 조가 되는 동반이도 시 되는 댄에 다고데 din이 우메 라미노스. 디슈데 긍시 댄주 뭐이 총거에 뭐이 디지 동거 뭐이 총거에 뭐이 노스라 되게 댄주 송송한 되게. 어다 디 돔데 디지도. 다디 슈데마다 다 예배처디 유징원에 준비해서 파전이 시작이 말거다. 냐야 말거. 근데 인데 우먼 주고 나려야 대남 싱데 남제 제배 남도 예보 문신 텔레 현도 주고 직전 작별권에 예외 있는 사람들이 작별권에 예외 사람들 민감 사람들 작별권에 예외 되는 시기도 시우주 삼 당시 저리 그 삼다에 다가서 에카데미적으로 그지 말해 간단한 심규기 몽고티 세야 된다.
So, because of these things, Nagarjuna, for example, makes an equation between dependent origination and emptiness. Says that which is dependent and arisen is empty of intrinsic existence. So, therefore, there is nothing that is not dependently arisen, and there is nothing that is not empty of intrinsic existence. And so then the question arises: does that mean there is nothing out there? So here, one needs to come up with some understanding of what reality. And here, Chandrakirti has a really good advice, which is that having objectively searched for something to be out there, when at the end of a result you don't find it, then the only existence that we can attribute to them is at the conventional level. It is only by means of convention.
Yes, thank you.
I think these views, I may say, are very scientific.
Yes. So should I?
Would you like to have a few moments to
Yes,
respond?
just
Only
a few seconds. Thank you very much, Your Holiness, for this detailed answer. I would like to point out that Buddhism and the Western civilization as a whole have taken completely opposite path at the beginning, because one was going towards inwards inquiry, the other one was going towards trying to understand nature of reality by external inquiry. And yet, when you go, the lesson of the West is that when you go at the far end of this external inquiry, such as in modern physics, you hit the limits of objectivity. And therefore, you are forced to recognize something different and connect, for instance, to the wisdom of Buddhism. And I must say, it's exactly my personal story, because I was a student of quantum mechanics. I was to understand that when I had the feeling that I had understood the views of Niels Bohr, Schrödinger, and all these people, I had unease, because it didn't fit with my prejudice, my classical views of the world. I wanted to discover the nature of reality as an object. For me, reality was an object, not something more involved than that. And when I realized that it was not possible, I felt a little bit strange. And then I discovered Buddhism. And I said, that's it. That fits.
Thank you, Michelle.
Thank you.
Thank you, Your Holiness.
디지 전이들스 되게 안데 땡중과 송송 땡중리야 균적이 땡중스나 남과 영조로 건데 되고 그래 다 차를 때에 땡중스는 우리 런기베 다된 되게 그래 다 명장 다여 점사 탄예를 때네 여점 사디 다 탄예들한 점 신기 우매에 송돼야지 땡중을 못 숨쉬는 거
So, in Professor Thilaratna's presentation, there was the important emphasis placed on understanding dependent origination, dependent arising. In the Sanskrit tradition, one makes distinction between different levels of understanding of this concept. One is dependent origination in terms of causes and effects, so causal dependence. The other one is dependent, and that is common to all the Buddhist schools. And then dependent origination is also understood in terms of dependence between parts and whole, which is a bit more sophisticated kind of a concept. It's not just causal dependence and temporal dependence, but it's more of an idea of an identity of a phenomena. And then in the Madhyamaka school in particular, again, another level of those schools that do not accept any notion of objective reality, even on a conventional level, they understand dependent origination in terms of dependent designation. The fact that the identity is a construct of dependent labels and so on.
So
three levels of meaning. It's a pratita samopadya.
Tripta Jimpa, I now ask you to take the stage.
Your Holiness, Your Eminences, Gandhi Rinpoche and Khenchen Tangol Rinpoche, distinguished participants, scholars, faculties and students of Central University of Tibetan Studies, and friends. I'm deeply honored to have this opportunity to be part of this two-day historic conference on mind in Indian philosophical schools of thought and modern science. So at the beginning, I would like to express my deep appreciation to the university and Chancellor Gisela and Professor Pradeep Gogal for inviting me and including me as part of the presenters here. I feel a little uncomfortable stepping out of my traditional role as His Holiness's interpreter and speaking in my own voice, but I would like to seek your permission first. My presentation, unlike all the other speakers, is really not to His Holiness, but to my actually fellow panelists and speakers and respondents. What I would like to present is to add yet another piece of the jigsaw puzzle or the mosaic that is really the rich Indian philosophical tradition. Yesterday, we listened to a rich presentation of the very profound ideas from different Indian traditions, starting from Samkhya, Advaita Vedanta, Nyaya, and Jain. And this morning, we were treated to a wonderful presentation on the Theravada understanding of the concept of mind, and then followed by Professor Bitbol's beautiful presentation, particularly from the perspective of Erwin Schrödinger. What I would like to do is really add one more piece, this time from the Indian Buddhist philosophical schools of thought. I wouldn't call it Mahayana tradition, because Mahayana is such a broad tradition, and I'll be in fact focusing specifically not just on one system of thought, which is the Buddhist Pramana tradition, Tsema tradition, but in fact on one thinker, Dignaga, who is a 5th century great Indian philosopher. My presentation is divided into two parts. The first part is a little bit more technical, so I'll ask your patience, which is looking specifically at Dignaga's two arguments for making the case for what I call dual aspected character of consciousness, Lo Chunyi. And in the second part, my attempt would be to extrapolate what we can learn from Dignaga's this particular idea and see whether we have some important lessons and insights for the general quest, the contemporary quest for understanding what consciousness is. So at the beginning, yesterday, we were reminded by Professor Pradeep Gogal about being careful about what we mean by the different terms when we use the word mind, consciousness, and so on. And this morning, Professor Tilak Ratna also, beautifully explained how the three terms in the Buddhist tradition, Citta, Manas, and Vijnana, Sim, Yi, and Namshe, mind, which we translate as mind and mental faculty, and consciousness are used. So what is that phenomenon that we are talking about? And I have one quote from one of the Mahayana Sutras, very well known, and this can be taken from many other similar Mahayana texts. And this gives you a general idea of what we are talking about when we are talking about mind or consciousness in the Buddhist Mahayana schools. I read the quote, "The mind has no material form, it is not demonstrable, has no appearance, no resistance, no fixed locus or spatial locus, and cannot be perceived by other senses." So we can see that although Buddhism I wouldn't characterize as being dualistic, but when it comes to defining what consciousness and mind is, it tends to do by contrasting. So unlike mind, there's material things, there is no material form and so on. So this, you can get a sense of, there is an idea that we are talking about something that has no extension, something that has no form, something that has no fixed spatial location, and something that cannot be perceived by others directly. So those are characteristics. So let me now go to Dignaga's argument. And in fact, to give a context, Dignaga is making this case in the context of analyzing a simple act of cognition. Yesterday in a Naya presentation, we were, explained that the act of cognition can be described in terms of an agent, an act, an actor, and so on. Here, Dignaga is trying to give his own account of this. So, and he calls it Divirupa, Chulnyi. So this is, and I translate in English as a dual aspect character of consciousness. Dignaga provides two arguments. And of course, Dharmakirti, his brilliant commentator, develops on this and also brings a lot more new reasoning for this. But the first argument is quite interesting, and I will just read it. If you compare the structure of the recollection of seeing blue with the actual experience itself of seeing blue, he says that the former, the recollection, has a double aspect. It has the object perceived, the aspect of the object perceived, as well as the experiencing of that object, because it is the recollection of seeing blue. It's not just the perception of the blue. All subsequent recollections, so this recollection of the recollections, and so on, he says that an additional, all subsequent recollections, remembering of remembering, each will thus acquire one additional aspect, which is akar, as if viewed through layers of filter until the chain ends. So you can see that every time a new aspect comes up. Therefore, cognitions possess an objective aspect, Suen number, Grahakara, as well as subjective aspect, Zimben number. Otherwise, cognition of the object and cognition of its cognition would be indistinguishable. So he makes the distinction that the fact that you can have multiple aspects as you have more and more layers of recollection is an indication that there is an objective aspect that is imprinted to the perception when you first see this blue object in front of you. Yushepada, Teshepa. So this is Pramana Samuchaya, which exists only in Tibetan, both the root text as well as the auto commentary. So this is chapter 1, 11.1ab. The second argument, again, uses memory, and it says that, in fact, that in our recollections of past experiences, we are able to distinguish between different perceptions of seeing a form as opposed to hearing a sound and so on, indicates that our experience have dual dimensions, an objective one and a subjective one. Not only are we able to remember the specific object experience, but we are also able to remember the modality of that experience. When you remember seeing something, you remember hearing something. So he says that unless there are two aspects to the experience itself, you cannot have these distinctions in your memory. So he's using, this is verse 11c. And then he says, furthermore, he says that through this reasoning of memory, one thing that also suggests is that the consciousness is reflexive. Consciousness must know itself. So he says that this memory argument implies that consciousness is reflexive, svasamviti, because memory requires a prior existence, a prior perception, as well as the perceiving of that object. To have such a recollection of the subjective side of experience, that of seeing the object, there is no need for an additional second order to subsequent cognition to be present. This indicates that the original experience itself has a reflexive dimension. So, and the reasoning is simply the following. The subject, the perception of blue, the perceiving blue, must have a prior experience, because when you remember seeing blue, you also remember not just the blue that you have seen, but also you remember seeing it. So memory has both subjective dimension as well as objective dimension. So this, of course, is controversial within the Buddhist schools. Many other schools, Buddhist traditions reject this, and particularly a strong reflexive thesis. So the key points of this particular reflexive awareness thesis is that it says the consciousness is self-presencing, self-luminous, inherently reflexive. And because if it is not itself luminous, then it wouldn't have the capacity of illuminating others, like objects. The second point is that this reflexive awareness is not a separate cognitive strand. It's an essential feature of the experience itself. That's another important point. And the way in which the consciousness is aware of itself is not in a subject-object, way, but in an intransitive way, So this, I think, is an important point. So I'm going to skip the next one because, for sake of time. Now to move to the next part of my talk. So from this, now this is of course my own opinion. I believe that looking at this very small section of Dignaga's idea, we can see a suggestion of a basic structure of consciousness. A basic structure of consciousness, he's arguing, seems to have three aspects. One is the intentional aspect, which is the object in front of you. There's an object directedness. It's consciousness about something. The other one is the subjective dimension, which is the experience itself. What primary character of consciousness is the experience itself. And then there is the reflexive dimension, which is the mind's ability to reflect upon itself or know itself. And so we can extrapolate these three and really come up with a suggestion that these are in fact suggest a structure of consciousness. So to go more specifically, intentionality is of course a Western phenomenology term, but it works really well with the Buddhist idea. And Dharmakirti has this line which says, Namshe Yuzin Pa Yichu. The apprehension of an object is the defining characteristic of consciousness. So that really is exactly the idea of intentionality as expressed in Western thought. For example, Franz Brentano was a German philosopher who had influenced phenomenology extensively. He writes, every mental phenomena is characterized by what the scholastic of Middle Ages called intentional, in existence of an object, and what we would call, although not entirely in unambiguous terms, the reference to a content, a direction upon an object by which we are not to understand the reality in this case, or an immanent objectivity. So he's basically saying intentionality relates to the content of that experience. And that idea is really very similar to Dharmakirti's line, where he says that apprehension of an object is the characteristic of consciousness. Subjectivity is basically the phenomenal first-person character of our mental life. Whether it is thoughts, whether it is perceptions, whether it is sensations, they are all from the perspective of an individual experiencing them. There is that irreducible first-person character. And here, this has been a major interest in contemporary Western thought, and particularly triggered by an influential paper written in 1974 by Thomas Nagel, which was a very short paper, and it's called What Does It Feel Like to Be a Bat? And really captures that difficulty of reducing the subjectivity that is the defining feature of. Now, reflexivity is a bit more complicated, thesis, and of course, as Jay Garfield, he's a major critique of this reflexivity thesis. But I would actually suggest we make distinction between two forms of thesis: a strong thesis and a moderate thesis. The strong thesis is the one that Dignaga has presented, where consciousness is aware of itself in a non-dualistic manner, and there is no subject-object character. And this is very powerfully captured in Shantarakshita's line, where he says that nature of consciousness is reflexive awareness, and that which is not reflexively awareness is insentient. Namshe pempe rangshin le dogba karsa dogba rabdo kewa de di karsa pempe rangshin kain ba te di dani sheba. So that line, he basically, and then he goes on to say that there is no subject-object dimension to this experience, it's non-dual. Now, I would suggest there is also a moderate thesis. Here I'm looking at you, where one could accept reflexivity, but not in this very strict sense, but in the general idea that mind, unlike matter, has a capacity to reflect upon itself. And if we take the moderate thesis, then any account of consciousness will have to explain that. So to conclude, I would, so my contention is that looking at Dignaga, we really have the beginnings of a suggestion of a basic structure of cognition or consciousness, which includes these three features: the intentionality, that is object-directedness or content-related; subjectivity, which is the experience itself; and then reflexivity, which is the mind's capacity to know itself. And together, they provide some idea of what is a basic structure of consciousness. I'm not talking about specific, I'm talking in general sense. Then, although Dignaga's own formulations is based on the concept of akar, aspect, number, and also reflexive awareness, svasamvit, both of which have been, rejected and critiqued. For example, like the Buddhist school, Vaibhashika does not accept akar theory. It's a nirkaravatin. Similarly, Nyaya and also Jain and Mimamsakas don't accept akar theory. Similarly, the Svasamvit, the strong reflexivity thesis, is rejected by Buddhist schools like Chandrakirti and Shantideva and so on. But I don't think accepting these three features as a constitutive of consciousness requires buying into the specifics of Dignaga's theory. And therefore, I would argue that any comprehensive theory of consciousness must account for these three features that make up what we call mind or consciousness.
Thank you very much, Jimpala.
Thank you. Tujiche. Dhanyawad.
Your Holiness, may I ask you to offer some remarks before we close the session?
그래도 참아봐. 그래서 다회사로만 레이드산에 간다다 송진 이동 때코는 이순 거야래. 다든지 인도산에 다 치송 다든산에 많이 배터는 치송도 바까. 아니 난 즈버 등주셔고. 자, 이제 인도산에 다 즈버 등주셔야 될이야. 다 치송어디 예매딘 즈베 타체. 즈버디 예매디 렁리가 참아고 그랬다. 다 네가 알고 그래. 자상가 시발이야 같이대 신리 아니 진놈 양가와 렁리 다 렁리 주야베 캐치부지야디 가다 시바 든주 쉐고 거다. 사들이 인도산에 아다 디디 더루선에 쉐고잖아. 러면 전화한다. 저라 가다 송진이도 그때 거는 시기 인도산에 지금 타녀도의 랑zen 미시베 답로벨 랭댕기 지잖아. 다 타녀도 랑zen 시기야 되냐? 치르 시든 시기야래. 산다 주지로 그렇게 송이나. 뭐야 증명도. 야, 다 간다 타녀도 랑zen 미시베다 오마베 아니 치송어다 랑zen바 타녀도 연염 명대 샤성. 다 명대 샤성 그 타녀도 연염 랑sen이 뭐주냠 송도가 나디디 가 즈버든주션 신베이나 가르샤네 디두디디 셰베 셰베지로 셰베 샤샤로 다 셰버든주션이 되잖아요. 데려 아테가 즈버디 슉슉실레임지. 데려샤.
So I'm translating for His Holiness here. Of course, the great masters like Dignaga and Dharmakirti were amazing epistemologists, Pramana scholars, and you can see that through their writings, that how deep thinkers they were. But from an ontological standpoint, and they subscribed to the view of non-duality of subject and object, and rejected the reality of external physical objects. So in this way, they subscribe to the view that consciousness is more ultimate than material entity. And so one needs to understand one of the reasons why they posit this very strong reflexive awareness thesis, because the denial of object, external object, is grounded upon this understanding of the mind. And then how do you ground the reality of the mind? The grounding of the reality of mind is based on this idea of self-reflexivity, which is non-conceptual. So there is a self-luminosity of the mind is what grounds the ultimate reality of consciousness. So this is the reason why the Savasamvit concept was critiqued by other Buddhists who reject any notion of objectivity or ultimacy, whether to mind or objects. So, for example, those masters who reject the notion of intrinsic existence, even on the conventional level, for them, there is no point in prioritizing the reality of object and subject. Just as objects are conventionally real, just as the subjects are conventionally real, objects are also conventionally real. Just as in the ultimate sense, object cannot be found as having intrinsic existence, similarly the subjects will not be found to have. So there is no point in making that kind of a hierarchical distinction. And these masters will therefore take to task the idea of this Savasamvit, which seems to underpin the belief in some kind of ultimacy of the consciousness. So those contexts need to be understood.
Thank you very much, Your Holiness.
아니, 우모버, 아니, 취소하다 나은지버, 아니 타녀도 연염, 따르잖아, 니기 매대봐, 모니기 매봐, 매념, 어디 뒤숭내근 거네, 샤이나, 어디 투전 집에 아들 셔야돼, 아니, 숭어 치든 까베찬에 차다와.
So from the point of view of the Madhyamaka thinkers who reject this hierarchical distinction of the reality between the object and subject and argue that just as on the conventional level they are real, they are unreal as well. So from the point of view of perspective of that school, the presentations that Jimpa just made would be seen as being nihilistic because it rejects the reality of external world. And from the point of view, it will also be seen as absolutist, reification or absolutist or eternalistic because it tends to reify the reality of consciousness. So it's fallen into extreme of both nihilism and eternalism.
So in any way, you see these different sort of great thinkers, sort of different way of presentation is very, very helpful. You see, to increase our sort of the ability of intelligence, analyze. Just take one and believe that, and then no longer further development. So contradictory philosophy is very, very helpful to increase our ability to analyze like that. So very good.
Thank you very much, Your Holiness, for these wonderful remarks and for contributing so much to this conference and for defending me against Jimpala. And thank you, Jimpa, for a really terrific, terrific presentation. It's always good to argue with you. And please join me in thanking the entire panel this morning. So far, we've had a really great morning. It's time for a little bit of a break. Thank you, all of you. And once again, as we celebrate the tremendous success of the Central University of Tibetan Studies, let's remember that part of that success is its constant encouragement of the spirit of dialogue and discussion and openness, and to use this as an opportunity not only to celebrate, but to rededicate ourselves to that spirit of dialogue. Thank you.